I never expected to find 3 bulldozers blocking my driveway that Tuesday morning, or to see Patricia from the HOA standing smugly behind them. But they had no idea who they were messing with, or that I quite literally owned the ground beneath their feet. What would you do if you discovered your obnoxious HOA wasn't just harassing you illegally, but was also stealing thousands from your neighbors? I remember the day everything changed with absolute clarity. The morning sun warmed my back as I knelt in the soft, loamy dirt by my driveway, carefully planting the last of my tomato seedlings. After 15 years of working 80-hour weeks as a senior partner at my law firm, I had finally found peace in simpler things, like growing my own vegetables. The feel of the soil between my fingers, the promise of fresh produce, and the quiet satisfaction of watching things grow had become the anchor that kept me sane. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" I sighed before looking up, brushing my gloved hands against my apron. There stood Patricia Langley, arms folded tightly over her crisp white blouse, her perfectly highlighted hair unmoving in the breeze, and her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Good morning, Patricia," I said evenly, just expanding my vegetable garden a little. Her sharp eyes swept over the neat rows of raised beds that now lined the side of my driveway. She clicked her tongue as though I were a misbehaving child. "This is completely unacceptable, Thomas," she snapped. "Front yards in Brookhaven Hills must be properly landscaped with approved ornamental plants. Vegetable gardens belong in the backyard, out of sight." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Patricia had been the head of our homeowners association for the last 5 years. In that time, what had once been a friendly, neighborly community had devolved into a battlefield of arbitrary rules and petty fines. "Patricia," I began, standing to my full height, and suddenly very aware of the dirt stains on my jeans and the smudges on my face. "My property deed predates the HOA by 30 years. I have grandfathered exemptions from most of these regulations." Her expression hardened. "That's not how it works," she retorted, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this violation. You'll be hearing from the board." I watched her take several photos of my garden, her fingers flying across the screen. 2 neighbors slowed their morning dog walk to witness the confrontation, exchanging uneasy glances. "I've read every line of the HOA bylaws," I said calmly, "and I've preserved every piece of correspondence from previous boards acknowledging my exemption. Would you like to see the paperwork?" She dismissed me with a wave. "Save it for the hearing," she sniffed. "You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation by tomorrow. I suggest you remove this." She gestured disdainfully at my tomatoes, before the fines started accumulating. As she marched off, I caught sight of Mr. Donovan from across the street, giving me a sympathetic nod. He'd recently had his own run-in with Patricia over his new mailbox. Apparently, his choice of emerald green paint wasn't HOA approved. That evening, true to her word, I found a glaring orange violation notice taped to my front door. A $53 daily fine until the so-called unapproved agricultural activity was removed. My hearing was scheduled for the following week. I sighed, adding the notice to an already thick file labeled HOA nonsense in my home office. But something about this particular confrontation felt different. More targeted. Personal. Later that night, my phone rang. It was Maria Velasquez, the elderly widow who lived 2 doors down. "Thomas, dear," Maria's voice crackled over the line. "I saw Patricia hassling you this morning. You're not the first, you know. Last month, she had the board fine the Nelsons $500 because their granddaughter's wheelchair ramp wasn't aesthetically consistent with the rest of the neighborhood." "That can't be legal," I said, stunned. "It wasn't," Maria confirmed, "but the Nelsons couldn't afford to fight it. They paid the fine and repainted the ramp. And Patricia's been getting bolder ever since Robert, her old college friend, became the HOA's lawyer," she added grimly. I thanked Maria and hung up. That night, sleep did not come easily. The following morning, before heading to the firm, I decided to go through some of my family's old property records. My family had owned most of this land before selling to developers in the late 70s. I vaguely remembered my father saying something about retaining certain rights, but at the time, I hadn't paid much attention. As I rummaged through dusty boxes in my attic, the distant rumble of heavy engines startled me. I rushed to my front window and froze. 3 massive bulldozers were parked across my driveway, completely blocking my car. Patricia stood proudly beside them in a tailored pantsuit, alongside a tall man in an expensive suit I didn't recognize. A small crowd of neighbors had already gathered along the sidewalk, whispering and watching with wide eyes. I grabbed my phone and the folder of HOA documents. Whatever Patricia was planning, she had just made a grave mistake. I stepped out onto the porch. Patricia's smug smile widened, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Thomas Grayson," she called out loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "The board convened an emergency meeting last night. Your violations are so severe, we've authorized immediate corrective action." The tall man stepped forward. "I'm Robert Klein, legal counsel for Brookhaven Hills HOA. Under Section 8.3 of our bylaws, we're removing these unauthorized structures as an immediate remedy for public nuisance." I forced myself to stay calm as I walked toward them. My mind raced through legal strategies. I needed to stall. "Mr. Klein," I said steadily, "you might want to double-check your legal footing here. Those are temporary garden beds, not permanent structures. And more importantly, you're about to make a very expensive mistake." Robert's smirk faltered for a split second. "Your threats don't concern us, Mr. Grayson. We have full authority." Patricia stepped forward. "This stubbornness is unnecessary, Thomas. Agree to remove these eyesores, pay your fines, which are now $300, and we can move on." The bulldozer's engines revved menacingly. One operator looked uncomfortable, glancing back and forth between us. I pulled out my phone and began recording. "Before you proceed," I said, "you should know I've just texted my associate at the firm to join us, and you might want to reconsider where you've parked those machines." Patricia rolled her eyes. "Enough with the legal nonsense, Thomas. Nothing you say will stop this." At that moment, a black SUV pulled up. The neighbors parted as Sheriff Delgado stepped out, followed by a woman carrying several thick folders. Patricia's confident expression wavered. "There's no need for law enforcement," she said quickly. "This is an internal HOA matter." "Patricia," I said, smiling for the first time that morning, "I don't think you understand whose land you're standing on." The woman, Ms. Penelope Adams, the county clerk, struggled with a large set of maps as she spread them over the sheriff's hood. Neighbors inched closer, murmuring. "These," Penelope began, pointing to the faded documents, "are the original survey maps from 1975. And this is the property sale agreement between the Grayson family and Brookhaven Development Corporation." Patricia stepped closer, her tone shrill. "Whatever ancient paperwork you found can't override our HOA's authority." Sheriff Delgado cleared his throat. "You'll want to listen carefully, ma'am." Penelope adjusted her glasses. "The Graysons retained 3 key rights. First, the mineral rights under the entire 180-acre development. Second, all utility easements under the main roads. And third, explicit exemptions from any future homeowners association rules for the 5 properties they kept." I stepped forward. "My house is one of those 5. Robert fumbled through his briefcase. "Impossible. The HOA covenants apply to every property. Your covenant was formed in 1994, Penelope said patiently. "These agreements were registered in 1975. Pre-existing legal agreements take precedence." Patricia's face turned crimson. "This is a trick. Even if Thomas's house is exempt, he can't ignore community standards." Sheriff Delgado shook his head. "According to county law, he can. Vegetable gardens are legal in residential zones." The crowd murmured. I noticed Mr. Donovan filming the entire scene. Mrs. Patel translated for her elderly father. Patricia whirled toward the bulldozer operators. "This changes nothing. Proceed." The lead operator shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am. No court order. No go." I stepped closer. "Also, those machines are parked on an easement I still own. That's trespassing. And you brought them here intending to damage my property." Robert's whisper to Patricia made her pale. I turned to the sheriff. "I'd like to file a report." "We can handle that right now," Delgado replied. Patricia exploded. "You can't do this. The HOA has run this neighborhood for decades." "It's not sudden, Patricia," came a frail voice from the crowd. Maria Velasquez stepped forward. "Some of us have always known about the exemptions." Patricia sneered. "Stay out of this, Maria. Your Christmas lights hearing is next week." Several neighbors gasped. Maria only smiled. "Oh, I haven't forgotten. Just like I haven't forgotten when your husband built a shed 2 feet over the Johnsons' property line." Robert checked his watch nervously. "Patricia, we need to talk. In private." There will be no hearing, I said. Remove the bulldozers, or I file additional charges. As the bulldozers backed away, Maria squeezed my arm. Come by my house tonight. Bring your documents. There's more. Patricia and Robert retreated to their car. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in their eyes. Sheriff Delgado approached. Want to file that report now? Absolutely, I replied. And Sheriff? You might want to call the county prosecutor. As neighbors came over to inspect my garden beds with new admiration, I realized something. This wasn't just about tomatoes anymore. This was about standing up against corruption. And we were just getting started.